Hello, this is our Euro 199 presentation. My name is Blake,
My name is Colleen.
And I'm Dana.
and today we're going to be discussing both food and water security in Spain, but focusing on Granada.
First, we're going to be discussing the history of food and water security in Spain.
And then we're going to discuss and explore the current climate crisis and how Spain is trying to mitigate the effects of climate change and maintain food and water security for their people.
And then we'll be discussing a little bit of the different communities that exist in specifically Granada and how those different populations are impacted and perhaps discriminated in terms of food and water security. Let's go!
First, we're going to talk about the history of water in Granada and in Spain. First, to get an idea of where Granada is, it is a city in the autonomous community of Andalusia in Spain. It is pretty much like southern Spain. It's a little bit off the coast, so not quite near the water, but still close-ish. They say it's about an hour drive from it. It is also at the foot at the Sierra Nevada mountains, so it could get condensation and water from the mountains. And it's at the confluence of four rivers, the Darro, Genil, Monaquil, and Barrow. So it gets water from these various sources, but it is also good to note that Granada is also 738 meters above sea level, which in American terms is 2,421 feet above sea level on average. So because it is at such high levels, it does have some issues with getting water to the city. Additionally, this is a very hilly area. They say that Alhambras, which is one of the biggest structures that are in Granada, which is where when tourists go, they usually go to visit the Alhambra Palace. That is on one hill in Granada, but one of the most populated areas of the city is the Albaicín, which is actually on the opposite side of Granada on its own separate hill. So in addition to Granada already being so elevated, most of the places that people live are actually on top of hills, which when you think about it, usually people get water because they're at the bottom of a mountain or they're at the bottom of a hill and rivers are going down to it. Um, there's actually a lot of different ways that Granada has dealt with this issue before and tried to ensure water security in the past 1,000 years. One of the most popular ways that they have done it, basically since the 11th century under the Ziri dynasty, is actually through the Ana de Mar water channel. The Ana de Mar water channel is a system of water channels that come from the Fuente Grande, um, a really big fountain that is a well that gets water to it, and it distributes this water to all sorts of different places throughout Granada. It first was meant to give water to the palaces, like the Alhambra Palace and several other palaces that were in Granada. Eventually, then it was passed to different mosques. Then they realized that they have so much water in the system that they could actually extend where water is going to and send it to villages. This water was potable water, so people could drink it. It was also used for water irrigation. And basically, every time that people were moving further and further away from the palaces, or villages that were outside of the palaces wanted water, what they would do is they would make the Ana de Mar water channel larger or longer. To this day, it is now about 9 kilometers long, so it's pretty long. Um, and they would set up basically a little well for where the water would collect from the Ana de Mar water channel. And these things are called water cisterns. There's a picture in the bottom right-hand corner of a water cistern. These basically just hold a lot of water in them. They're also called aljabes because these originated as early as the 11th century, like I mentioned, which in Granada, if you know anything about it, it was ruled by Muslims up until 1492. In Spain, basically, there was a transition of power in the 12, 13, and 1400s where the Castilian Spanish people were trying to take different parts of the peninsula. Um, and Granada was actually one of the last places to fall because it was built so high up. Um, it was one of the last places to lose the Muslim power to the Christians, which was in 1492. That was another reason why Granada is built so high because it has a lot of security, but not necessarily water security, which is another reason why there's a lot of technology that's used to spread the water out. But back to the water cisterns. So most of the water cisterns as the Anadamar water channel got longer and wider, the water cisterns would be plopped into different villages so then people could have access to the potable water for drinking and their own irrigation, and also for religious practices. These water cisterns are mostly from the Muslim rule, the Arabic rule of Granada. There are some that were built during the Christian era, um, but when the Christians overtook this area, they basically kept the water channel that existed, the water cisterns, didn't touch it, and these systems lasted until 1945 when newer, better technology was introduced to have different ways of getting potable water. Um, Now they are mostly dried up. They have been recently restored because what was happening to these water cisterns was because they were empty and dried up because urban population increased and people were consuming too much water. Um, they ended up being trash bins for people. So the city of Granada ended up cleaning them out and then locking them up and making them more of a sight to see for tourists to see, for citizens to also see. Another technology that was used in medieval times and even more recent times was the idea of the double water wheel hydraulic system. Um, the idea is they were trying to take water from lower down to higher up. So they use a wheel to bring it up and then another wheel to bring it up. So then they can use this to also irrigate their orchards, irrigate their lands, and to just have accessible drinking water. And one of the last really cool technologies that they used in this water scarce area was a sewage system. So you don't want to have dirty water when you already don't have a lot of water. Granada was really ahead of its time. There's evidence of a sewage system, a pretty modern sewage system existing as early as the 11th century once again. It was under the roads and it was enclosed in brick, and it ran to everyone's home. So every single home had its own sewage system that they could do their business in. And then this water would run into the rivers that people didn't use as much. They're actually called muddy rivers. So in this time, people had rivers that they had for their water channels. Ana de Mar was not the only water channel, it was just one of the most popular ones. So they had their water channel that they used potable water for and irrigating water, and then they had muddy rivers that they had for sanitation purposes. Like I said, this wasn't one of the only water channels that existed. There's also, because this water channel ran into the Darro River, there are some water channels that were under the Darro River because water channels have to use salt, that different towns would also use. So, in an area that has water scarcity issues, Granada was able to thrive for the past 1,000 years using technology that was built in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, which is quite impressive. The only reason that some of this technology isn't used today is because better technology has been made in the past century or so. It's really important to emphasize that most of this technology was used even in the early 1900s. And we have the Muslims to thank for that.
Thank you, Colleen. Now, it's very apparent that human beings require food and water to survive. And in that way, our relationship with water is very important. The way that we use and maintain and interact with water is essential. we use it for drinking and sanitation, along with other uses that maintain our quality of life. But it has been defined by the UN or emphasized by the UN that agriculture is an essential use of water. Now, we're discussing the current water crisis, and it's not a lack of water because the water on this Earth system is relatively constant, but more importantly, the distribution is different. The same groups of people aren't getting water that they need, and so we have to consider things like agriculture as a means of using water. And so climate change is a reason that this distribution isn't uniform or isn't just anymore. And so with climate change and the lack of water resources in certain areas, there's um, perhaps more difficulty in growing food, and that coupled with population growth in certain areas is leading to difficulties, a crisis. And so that is how water is tied with food. Water is required for food to grow, therefore, food security is an important issue. And this is the physical availability, but also the economic availability of food. And it it, excuse me, depends on local production, the reserve and the market for food. And so how we turn food into nutrients is essential, but also how we grow food, handle it, and cook it is essential. Um, and climate change also affects how stable the food supply is, along with, of course, the water supply. And so these are some of the issues that we're going to discuss, and some of the important issues that people have to confront. So climate change, as we can see here on these plots, it's predicted that the um, global temperature. This is focusing on Spain, of course, but the global temperatures are rising and are expected to continue to rise if our human race doesn't make some important changes. And with these more elevated temperatures, along with more irregular rainfall patterns, um, growing food will be much more difficult. Um, Drought in certain areas may also threaten food growth. Another important consideration is that, as I previously mentioned, um, population growth is an important consideration. Now, also regarding demographics, people will migrate as their former homes are uninhabitable, excuse me, due to climate change. So this migration of human beings may lead to more stress on a food system, and this food security the food security may be more difficult to um, maintain. And so this not only impacts food itself, but also jobs. The amount of people that will need work increases. There might be um, perhaps more work available in agriculture. So that's just another consideration. Um, and so the UN, the United Nations, has outlined these Sustainable Development Goals um, in 2015, and it's on the right side here. We can see that zero hunger is an important goal number 2, along with goal number 6, which is clean water and sanitation. Now, again, both of these are intertwined, as I've already mentioned. Um, and so when we think about ways we can perhaps propose solutions, or simply try to improve our standing regarding climate change and hopefully um, mitigate some of the effects, we can think about things like more efficient agricultural techniques, legislative action, or other hard path measures to create more potable water, or convert more potable water. So some of the ecological solutions might be improving weather forecasting, or providing natural disaster plans. Now these are sort of ways we can mitigate climate change, but it doesn't really help water security. Legislation, rural investment with um, putting putting money into agriculture, or providing incentives, or implementing disease monitoring systems, so that maybe crops have a better yield. but again, not so much about water security. So one important consideration with water security that is widely used in Spain, and I'll discuss that shortly, is desalination. Now, other ways we can couple water and food and their security um, are changing agricultural practices, focusing strictly on agriculture. And what that might entail is changing planting cycles to favor different crops to keep the soil nutrient rich, improving land management skills to avoid erosion, and simply um, using water more efficiently. So again, this goes back to the tie between water and food. If we use water more efficiently, we can both grow more crops and also save more water for other uses that are important. So as I mentioned, desalination. Here along the coast, the eastern coast of Spain, we see many, many desalination plants. Here's a list from um, 2015 of not all of the desalination plants, but many of them. And so a lot of these, the majority of these desalination plants work with reverse osmosis, but there's other methods. In 2008, there were 819. Now, not all of them are, 819 desalination plants. Not all of them were huge plants, but that's how many there were. Um, Now, it's desalination in Spain specifically has grown, producing um, from in 1999 producing a half of a cubic meter per day, and in 2009, 10 years later, 2.5 million cubic meters a day. So it multiplied by 5 over that 10-year span. Um, Now, an important consideration is that desalination requires a lot of energy to perform, um, but both the energy requirement along with the cost requirement have dropped significantly as the technology has improved. So it's an important advancement technologically that desalination is reverse osmosis in specifically is becoming more affordable and more energy effective. Lastly, though, it is important to note that desalination has some potentially harmful impacts um, regarding brine spills or other chemical leaks. And then again, the question of the energy used. Now, one specific example in Alicante, in Spain, as a response to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2018, they've managed to divert some of the supply of desalinated water from the Alicante desalination plants to be drinking water. And although this plant has been operational for over 10 years, um, in order to focus on having potable water for drinking, they've decided that a certain percentage is going to be strictly for drinking, so as to not use so much on other purposes, such as agriculture. Speaking of agriculture, um, the next point is that sustainable agriculture can be performed sustainably. Um, as I mentioned, you can change planting cycles for different crops, improve land management, or use water more efficiently, because it's important to ensure food security for the system if we're using water more efficiently. Um, and agriculture is not only for water use purposes, but for carbon sequestration purposes. So thinking about climate change and remembering that the whole system is connected, um, we can think about how if we're using less water and benefiting the ecosystem more with agriculture, um, it'll benefit the other facets of our existence. Now here pictured on the slide are pictures from a greenhouse project in uh, Almeria, Spain, and it's a greenhouse dome. It's called um, Globodome, Green Domo, um, and it produces it's a minimal. The structure is minimal so that there's fewer shadows and fewer distractions distractions for the light to not be on the plants, and so it's maximizing the amount of solar radiation that's hitting the plants. And so it also requires, because of the design, it requires 70% less water than conventional agriculture. And Another very important consideration with this sustainable agriculture technique is that these domes can be built in almost any place. Um, and so with this sustainable agriculture technique, um, it can be in close proximity to cities. And so you can grow plants very close to cities all year round rather than growing them far away and having to transport them a long distance and again emit a lot of carbon dioxide as you're transporting them. Um, so with these current technologies we see today, our recommendation as a group, we've determined that it's probably best to focus on things like desalination and sustainable agriculture if we want to ensure food security along with water security. Thank you.
And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the discrimination in Spain. So there's a very big population of people in Spain, especially the southern area, Andalusia, called Romani or Roma. They used to be previously known as Gitanos or Gypsies, but this is now viewed as derogatory because they were falsely known to be from Egypt. When looking at their language and tracing back, we can actually determine that they were probably from the northern areas of India. This is a group of people that are nomadic and they came to Europe with bright, colorful clothes and music and dancing and singing and collected coins. And that's how they earned their living. And they just move from place to place. They don't really settle down in one place. And they have family and their community at the core. So this is a group of people that have been here for a very long time. And there are a lot of like tales on how they came here and who they are. The origin was a little bit unknown, and even within the community, they through generations, their origin was a little lost. It's just a nomadic community, and they define themselves by being separate from the surrounding community. So there are a few tales on how these people came to be. One tale in medieval Persia said that the king wanted his people to work only half of the day and relax to music while drinking and dancing and eating for the other half of the day. So he ordered or sent for 10,000 people from India to be sent here to play music and dance and sing for them. The king provided food and supplies. However, these Indian travelers didn't work. They got free food, so they just ate recklessly and didn't work at all. So the king was angered and told them that they should load their donkeys and travel the country, never settling down. So he ordered them to never settle down. And they began traveling and earning their living by singing. And that's one origin story. Another is that when they made it to Europe, they kind of started their own story on how they came to be in this lifestyle, and they made these stories so that they would be accepted by Christianity. So there are a few different stories to this as well. One of them is that the Holy Family came to them and they rejected the Holy Family to stay in their house, and so then now they have to wander for 7 years. The second is that the gypsies at the time actually made the 4 nails to crucify Jesus, but they stole one of them to save some suffering. And both of these stories don't sound super great, but people, especially in those medieval times, loved redemption stories. So the people who were now have to wander around for years and years in order to redeem themselves in the eyes of Jesus and Christianity, people ate that up. And so they were accepted into the community really quickly and really well. Over time, that ran pretty thin. They were amused by the people's clothes and dancing and all the instruments they brought. They brought bells and tambourines. But then they noticed that things were going missing from their bags and from their homes, like bread and water and little bits of money. So then their welcome ran a little thin. So throughout history, these people have been very discriminated. They distance themselves from society and they live differently. And, people don't like people who are different. And so there's been a lot of discrimination. There are protests even to this day that to give Roma people the same rights and to treat them the same. There is a bit of work towards trying to get rid of the negative stereotypes and things like that, but it's still very prevalent. Even in Granada, they asked a lot of school-age children, both part of the Romani and not part of the Romani, how they viewed, how they were being treated and things like that. And it's still a big issue today. And their lifestyle, their nomadic lifestyle leads them to, it's very difficult for them to get work because people don't trust them, and also because of their nomadic lifestyle they get temporary jobs, and it's this cycle of not wanting to give them a job and then them wanting to move around more, and it's this cycle, and then when they do get a job it's usually a lower job, and so then they have a negative view in society. So it's this cycle that continues and perpetuates this negative view of the Romani people. um, Additionally, they're forced out of society and um, forced to settle in the outsides of the society where conditions might not be as great and resources not as great. So a lot of the time they find themselves in poorer areas and without access to good water, good resources, good education systems. A lot of the times there's no need to implement those school systems, and so sometimes they're in undesirable locations like dump sites or close to toxic waste, and the government doesn't have a responsibility to sanitize or house or educate that area. So they face a lot of discrimination environmentally. They're more hit by the environmental issues regarding access to clean air and water and other natural resources. And it's just a continuing cycle, even throughout Spain and throughout all of Europe. In Granada, so as I said before, the Romani people are very prevalent in the south of Spain, especially in Granada. Actually, the La Alhambra, the very famous castle, was actually very populated with these Romani people who, were nomads, but they sought shelter in Granada, and so they stayed in La Alhambra when it was abandoned. So it was just this abandoned, worn down, big castle, big palace, and they were living there. And then once it became famous from a book by an American author, the government came in and wanted to renovate it so that it could be available for the public, and they kicked all the Romani out. So in Granada, there's this very popular place called Sacromonte. It's the caves of Sacromonte. You can see they built houses the into the mountainside, and so they live in caves. And this is historically where a lot of Romani people lived, and a lot of those following generations continue to live to preserve culture and things like that. But also a lot of people, a lot of other people, maybe sometimes known as modern gypsies, come here and live here to continue that lifestyle of the free-spirited, wanting to live with nature kind of lifestyle. And so there are some images here of the hillside of inside of a cave, and then on the left you can see flamenco dances. So flamenco originating from these Romani people. They still have shows every day, and a lot of people travel to the Sacramento caves in order to see real, authentic flamenco dances. Flamenco is from the suffering that these Romani people felt from all of the discrimination, and so it's a very powerful dance and performance. So the area of Granada is actually very rich in agricultural land and being able to be self-sufficient. And so in Granada, perhaps this is not as big of a problem with discrimination of resources to these Romani people, especially since there's such a big community here, and a lot of tourists also go here, and a lot of Spaniards also go here in order to enjoy the beautiful aspects of Romani culture, like the flamenco and the bright colors and music. um, it might not be as big of an issue. Food security in Granada is generally very good, although the number of people hungry has been rising every year. And so the concern, although currently they are able to sustain themselves and participate in society and live this beautiful life, there's a concern that as the poverty level and the hunger levels rise, the Romani community will be the first hit, just as with any other environmental issues that disproportionately affect the vulnerable groups. And that is it on the discussion on how these resources and the history of the Romani people work together. I think it's really interesting to look at all of the different communities that work and live in this area and how those different aspects play into it. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. We loved researching and discussing all of these wonderful, beautiful topics in the country that we all love so much, Spain.
Yes, we saw historically that water is a very important consideration to maintain security, as well as for agriculture, for growing crops. And then in today's day, it appears that desalination, along with more sustainable agricultural practices, are the best methods of maintaining both food and water security. And of course, it's important to consider that all groups of people in Spain are benefiting and not just the most affluent. So
Thank
thank you very much.
you.
Bye. Hope you
Thank you
enjoyed
very
our
much for coming.
talk.
This was a wonderful class. Thank you so much.